As we start looking at our study of federalism, let's take a look at some important numbers that your book and textbook authors introduced to you. 1 is the number of national governments, 0.00001% of all government. 90,126 is the estimated number of governments in the United States. 2.8 is the number of non-military personnel in millions who work for the federal government. 3,031 is the number of parish or county governments, 3.5% of all government in America. 87,044 is the number of town or city governments, 96.6% of all government. 50 is the number of state governments, 0.1% of all government. 13.7 is the number of non-military personnel in millions who work for local governments. 17 is the percentage of Americans who say that they trust their national government to do what is right most of the time. 72 is the percentage of Americans who say that they trust local governments to do what is right most of the time. 5.1 is the number of non-military personnel in millions who work for state governments. The first form of government that your textbook looks at is unitary government. In a unitary government, national polity is governed as a single unit, with the central government exercising all or most of the political authority. And this was most nations in the 1780s. The national government was there to make policy for the nation, and the local government was an administrative extension of the national government. So this was a highly centralized form of national authority. It had none, weak, or very dependent government subunits, and less people participated in the process, especially in colonial America, because everything was done in London, and of course we're 3,000 miles away. A confederation is a group of independent states or nations that yield some of their powers to a national government, although each state retains a degree of sovereign authority. And that's the key. States are going to retain authority. Most power goes to the states or to the provinces and the local governments. This has weak central authority for the common defense or economic benefits. So it's pretty much a handshake between the states to form a government that's a national government with very little power going to the national government. It's an alliance of equal partners or entities, and each entity has an authority, and all of the authority that isn't delegated goes to each individual state or part of the Confederacy. In the Constitutional Convention and in our constitutional setting for federalism, the delegates devised an innovative hybrid plan that they called a federal system. This federal system, in which power is divided and shared between national and state governments. The Constitution gives some decisions to the national government, and it gives others to the states. But this builds conflict into the system between those state units and the national government. And it also has independent local governments that are actually units of the state, not of the national government. So if you look at this chart, the Constitution is the head of our government in terms of, and we the people, in terms of the laws that we follow. And then we have the national government and its three co-equal branches of governance: legislative, executive, and judicial. And then we have our state governments, which are bound by the United States Constitution and by the state constitutions. And they also have three co-equal branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. And then local governmental units are underneath those state governments. Now, if you look at this chart, notice that the closer the government gets to the people, as levels move from national to local, the more trust is built in. So as we move from down here and we move up, the level of trust increases. This is one reason that the idea of a confederation made sense at first, because state and local governments are closer to the people. So the idea was, let's give those state and local governments as much authority as we can. The national government would seem very distant and untrustworthy, and people didn't trust it, didn't want it. The same is true today. Who holds government authority? This is the most important issue in federalism. Who decides what? There are advantages to a state-level policy because the states are more responsive to citizens' needs and desires. The argument is that states become what they call laboratories of democracy. The states offer more protection for individual rights, in theory. But there's no consistency between the states. And federalism fosters political innovation. But federalism gives people more choices because you have different state governments, so theoretically you can vote with your feet. But if you don't like the laws of the state of Texas right now and you don't have a lot of money, voting with your feet can become a problem. And that becomes the downfall of this. So there are advantages of a policy that favors a national authority. First, they tend to be more fair because they're equal across the states. They do tend to equalize resources across the nation, and they standardize best practices for what works and what doesn't. Of course, it also, though, alleviates that laboratory of democracy that a state can have when it wants to try something a little different. 2, we see individual income tax rates by state, and you're going to see some states like Texas that have nothing in them. Then you're going to see a state like California, one like New York, Vermont. These states have really, Washington, D.C., these states have really, really, really high tax rates. So, for instance, there's big differences between $100 that you earn in North Dakota, where you're going to pay $3 on that, versus in California, where more than $13 goes to the state treasury. 7 states that are colored in gray on the map levy no income taxes at all. 2 others tax only dividends and interest income. And here's the tough question. Can Americans really pick up and move, though, to a state that reflects their own values? We call this voting with your feet. Is that, I mean, a lot of people from California and New York have moved to states like Texas, Florida, Nevada. And the reason for this is because of state taxes, and because of employment opportunities. But not everybody can do that. And it tends to be that those who have more money are able to be more mobile in terms of moving from state to state for something like this than others. So the question becomes, is that fair? Why do you think that people voted have been voting with their feet lately? Now, it's very important to understand that under federalism, the Constitution is what unifies this nation and sets the ground rules. Without a Constitution, federalism is a very difficult proposition, that sharing of power. The Constitution grants national authority. There are 19 powers that are vested in the national government, and these are called the delegated powers. The Commerce Clause empowers Congress to regulate commerce. The Necessary and Proper Clause is Congress's constitutional authority to exercise the necessary and proper powers to carry out its designated functions. We call these implied powers. The Supremacy Clause is the national government's authority to prevail over any conflict. And the inherent powers say that neither those specified or implied by the necessary for the federal government go to the states. So that Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2, all right, it establishes a level of authority. United States Constitution being on top, then acts of Congress, then state constitutions, then state laws, and then city and county governments, which are creations of the state. It buttresses the delegated and implied powers. It's the national authority that prevails over any conflicting state or local governmental claims. And in the inherent powers, these are powers that are not specified or implied by the Constitution, but are necessary for the President or Congress to fulfill their duties. The Constitution protects state authority. States have authority granted by the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and it reserves to the states all powers that are not specifically granted to the national branches. And that's why we call these reserved powers. And these are the constitutional guarantee that the states retain government authority not explicitly granted to national government. The Constitution authorizes a sharing of power. States and national authorities share many of their responsibilities. Concurrent powers are those that the governmental authority is shared by national and state governments. So when they're shared, then that becomes a concurrent power. For instance, the power to tax. Full faith and credit refers to the constitutional requirement that each state recognize and uphold the laws passed by another state. And the Constitution empowers and limits both the national and the state governments. So it gives them power and it also limits their power. So like this chart shows, which is also in your book, you have your powers of national government, which include the power to regulate trade, coin money, maintain and arm forces, declare war, and establish post offices. Your powers that are given to the state government are reserved. These are to control public education, punish criminals, protect public health and safety, conduct elections, and establish local governments. And then you have your concurrent powers. The power to maintain law and order, the power to levy taxes, the power to borrow money, the power to take land for public use, to provide for the public welfare, and to establish a court system. So the Constitution delegates some powers to the national government, some powers to the states, and some powers to both. The joint or concurrent powers have stretched dramatically over the years as the government has entered into previously untried policy areas like education and healthcare. There are different kinds of federalism. The federal system from the creation of the Constitution and the establishment of this country up till 1933 was one of dual federalism, or the layer cake method. Basically, each level of government kept to itself. State and national governments had relatively clear responsibilities. The state government wielded at least as much power as the federal government did. Under layer cake federalism, you have separate layers of government. Now, the national government is in charge of three major areas: international relations, international improvements, and the regulation of relations and commerce between and among the states. And the states retained control over just about everything else having to do with individual citizens. From 1933 to 1981, you had something called Cooperative Federalism, or the marble cake, where the chocolate is mixed in with the vanilla. It mingles government authority with the functions and overlaps those functions across national and state governments. President Roosevelt and large Democratic majorities in Congress strengthened the national government's role with regard to federalism. Active federal government's involvement was the key, and it blurred the lines of authority. Under the marble cake model, different governments' functions swirl together, and you have to cooperate. Federal funds are granted to the states through grants and aid with specific instructions about how the money can be spent. Now, contested federalism is the model that we had from 1981 till pretty much now. And your book describes it as the super swirl cake federalism. It extensively mingles government authority as partisans try to influence policies by shifting functions between the national and the state governments. And this is where a lot of our division is coming from right now in the United States. Under Reagan, this form of federalism tipped the pendulum of power away from national officials more towards the authority to the states. That shifting from the federal government to the states is called devolution. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The super swirl cake federalism model is where government authority mingles governing authority with high partisan conflict between the states and the national government. Under new federalism, that's the authority is given from the federal officials to the state and local officials. That's devolution. And under block grants, this is the power that the federal government has in terms of giving money. Under a block grant, that money does not have strings attached. The national government funds specific policy areas with few restrictions and says states go at it as long as you spend the money on what you're supposed to. Progressive federalism is where the national government sets program goals and states determine how to achieve them. And that would be, the best example of that would be No Child Left Behind. So here are your three models: layer cake, marble cake, and super swirl cake. So today, the Trump administration is trying to go back to this era of new federalism. And under new federalism, the states regain power through tax cuts, domestic spending cuts, flexible block grants, the reduction in federal grant money that goes for specific purposes with specific strings attached. Government, according to Ronald Reagan, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. There are fewer federal dollars that are spent and fewer federal regulations. But that process of devolution, taking things from the federal government authority and responsibility and moving them over to the states, has its drawbacks as well. And the drawback a lot of times is unfunded mandates. Unfunded mandates are when you want something to be done, but you don't give the money to do it. So the legislature says this has to be done and doesn't give the money to do it. And it's an obligation that's imposed on a state or local government official by federal legislation without sufficiently funding or support to cover the costs. So reducing the federal government, devolution, is that transfer of authority from the national to the state or local government levels. And preemption is when the courts step in and invalidate a United States state law that conflicts with federal law. So we're going to talk more about that when we get to the courts. And in the courts, the courts are supposed to draw the line in a dispute as to who the winner, who the loser is going to be. And these disputes about drawing a line where national power ends and states' authority begins have been decided by the courts. They have favored national prerogatives in the early republic, and then they moved towards favoring state and private corporations, especially in the past 30 years, 40 years. Your book gives you several court decisions in Table 3.2. I'm not going to go over those, but I am going to go over some important court decisions that came down this year, this June and July, or June. So the FBI versus Fasaga upheld the use of anti-terrorism surveillance against Muslims in Southern California, saying that the power of the courts was misapplied by federal law, and it gave power back to the federal government and particularly to the FBI. Under Egbert versus Bull of 2022, it grants almost absolute immunity to immigration and customs enforcement officers with regard to federal lawsuits related to their normal and legal duties. In other words, if you are mishandled by a ICE official as an immigrant, you can't sue that ICE official. And that has to do with the whole dispute over separating families and especially putting children in cages a few years ago under Trump. Now, two of the recent decisions really favored state governments. And of course, the biggie this year is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Clinic, 2022, which effectively overturned the 50-year precedent case of Roe versus Wade in 1973, and it returns the authority for states to regulate and enforce abortion laws. And abortion is now completely legal or highly restricted, completely illegal or highly restricted in 28 states, mostly in the South and Midwest. In the West Virginia versus the EPA case, it has dramatically limited the power of the EPA and returned that power to the states. It prohibits the federal government from enforcing restrictions on the burning of fossil fuels and leaving policy making to the states for now. For instance, in a state like Texas, we're kind of saying, hey, burn more fossil fuel. But in California, if you noticed just recently, California just passed a law that said that by 2032, you can't buy a new gasoline-fueled car in the state of California. We'll see if that holds up. But that's two states going in two very different directions. Your book also talks about American nationalism. This is Americans' public sense of identity as Americans. It helps maintain a federal balance by instilling loyalty to the nation, the state, and a locality, and it can turn inward and exclude others. And we've seen both cases, right? Make America Great Again is really just a return to historical times. For instance, the Know Nothing Party, where they said, hey, if you're not American, get out, whatever American is. The rise of American nationalism comes, though, from an unlikely source, the Constitution itself. And your book makes several arguments about that I want you to make sure you read about. It's a double-edged sword. There's a strong sense of national identity that fosters mutual support and loyalty for us as Americans. But there's also most enthusiastic nationalists are those that most likely will draw strict boundaries about who counts as an American. And these are people who are, for policy purposes, religious purposes, cultural purposes, language purposes, trying to exclude others. And remember also that nationalism preys on America's weak national governmental system. Remember that Ronald Reagan also, the key to all this, said, man is not free unless government is limited. And Article 1 of the Constitution basically becomes an issue in and of itself because that's the legislature. How much power does the legislature have? How much power does the executive have? The strength of central governments is measured by three principles: size, authority, and independence. And as we see here, the levels of government grow as you go down towards state and local governments. And there's a reason for that. The founding fathers believed, and people at that time believed, that government was better at the local level. So in terms of size, the American national government is smaller than that of other nations. It grew after World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and the Great Society of the 1960s. But lately, it's been shrinking. The mid-19th century, nations had powerful and efficient national bureaucracies and civil service, and that's what the national government was all about. The American government did not have strong central bureaucracies. American civic volunteerism, Americans stepping up and taking like for instance in a hurricane or a natural disaster, participating in public life without government incentives or coercion is what we've always been about. And independence. There is a separate and dividing line about who governs power. The vertical dimension talks about power sharing among different levels of government. Each level has an internal check and balance system. Those checks and balances, again, are found at